Imagine waking up every single day of your life and not knowing where you are. Not because you're lost, but because the last thing you remember happened years ago and every day since has simply failed to stick. Imagine meeting the same doctor, the same researcher, the same familiar face hundreds of times over the course of decades, and each time, as far as your own mind can tell you, it is the very first time you've ever seen them. For a man named Henry Molaison, known to the scientific world for most of his life only by his initials, HM, this wasn't a thought experiment. It was every day, for 55 years. His story begins not with the injury that would define his life, but with a much smaller one. As a child, Henry was struck by a bicycle and shortly afterward began experiencing seizures, minor at first, then increasingly severe as he grew older. By the time he reached his 20s, the seizures had become so frequent and so disabling that he could no longer hold down a job or live anything resembling a normal, independent life. He tried medication after medication. Nothing brought him lasting relief. In 1953, at the age of 27, Henry and his family made a decision that would eventually reshape our understanding of human memory itself. He agreed to undergo an experimental surgery performed by a neurosurgeon named William Beecher Scoville, with the goal of stopping the seizures that had taken over his life. Scoville's approach, informed by the medical thinking of the time, targeted a region deep inside the brain called the medial temporal lobe, and specifically a small seahorse-shaped structure on each side of the brain known as the hippocampus. Scoville had noticed in some of his other patients that removing tissue from this region seemed to reduce psychiatric symptoms, and he theorized it might do the same for Henry's seizures. So, in an operation that by today's standards would be considered almost unthinkably experimental, Scoville removed a significant portion of tissue from both sides of Henry's brain, including most of the hippocampus on each side, along with surrounding structures. The surgery worked in the narrowest sense of the word. Henry's seizures became dramatically less frequent and severe, but almost immediately it became clear that something else, something no one had anticipated, had gone catastrophically wrong. Henry could still think clearly. He could still hold a conversation. His intelligence, by every measure available at the time, remained fully intact. In some tests, it even appeared slightly improved, likely because the seizures were no longer disrupting his cognition. He remembered his childhood. He remembered his life up until roughly the moment of the surgery. His personality, his sense of humor, his politeness, all of it remained recognizably him. But he could not form new memories, not in any lasting way. He could hold a piece of information in his mind for a matter of seconds, sometimes a couple of minutes if he concentrated and rehearsed it deliberately. But the moment his attention shifted elsewhere, that information was gone as completely and irretrievably as if it had never existed at all. Ask Henry what he'd eaten for breakfast an hour earlier, and he could not tell you. Not because he'd forgotten in the ordinary sense, the way any of us might forget a small detail, but because, as far as his own conscious experience was concerned, the meal had simply never registered as an event at all. For decades afterward, Henry lived almost entirely in the eternal present. Researchers who worked with him for years, sometimes visiting him weekly for stretches lasting into decades, would need to reintroduce themselves every single time. He never learned their names in any way that stuck. He never remembered the thousands of hours of tests he'd sat through. He would greet each new session as though it were his very first encounter with the entire field of memory research, politely, warmly, and with absolutely no recollection of the years of collaboration that had already passed. There is something almost unbearably lonely about this if you sit with it for more than a moment. Henry's mother passed away years after his surgery. He was told, and he grieved. Then, some time later, having no memory that the conversation had ever taken place, he was told again for what was, to him, the very first time. Researchers and family members had to make careful, often difficult decisions about which painful truths to repeat to a man who could never carry grief forward into a settled, integrated part of his life. Every loss was new. Every loss had to be relearned and refelt over and over again. And yet, what makes Henry's case one of the most important in the history of neuroscience isn't simply the tragedy of it, though the tragedy is real and worth sitting with honestly rather than rushing past on the way to the science. It's what his condition revealed, almost by accident, about the actual architecture of human memory. Before Henry, most researchers assumed memory was a single, unified function, that, if you could remember anything at all, that ability worked more or less the same way across every type of memory a person might form. Henry's case proved with startling clarity that this assumption was wrong, because it turned out that Henry could learn some new things, not facts, not names, not events, but skills. In one of the most famous experiments to come out of his case, a researcher named Brenda Milner asked Henry to trace a star pattern while looking only at its reflection in a mirror, a task that requires the brain to override its normal hand-eye coordination, since everything appears reversed. It's a difficult task for anyone at first, full of mistakes and overcorrections. Over repeated daily sessions, Henry's performance on this task improved steadily, exactly as it would for anyone without memory impairment. His lines grew straighter, his errors fewer, his movements more confident. The catch was that every single day, when he sat down to try the task again, Henry had no conscious memory of ever having done it before. He would tell Milner, honestly and without any sense that he was contradicting himself, that he'd never attempted anything like this in his life. And then his hands would perform the task better than they had the day before. Guided by a kind of learning his conscious mind had no access to whatsoever. This single, quietly astonishing result helped reveal that memory isn't one system. It's several, running in parallel, dependent on different structures in the brain. There's declarative memory, the kind we usually mean when we talk about remembering anything at all, the facts, names, conversations, and events of our lives, which depends heavily on the hippocampus that Henry had lost. And there's procedural memory, the memory of how to do things, physical skills, and learned behaviors, which turned out to live somewhere else in the brain entirely, in structures that Henry's surgery had left largely untouched. Before Henry, no one had proof this separation existed in such a clean, demonstrable way. After Henry, an entire field of neuroscience reorganized itself around the distinction his case had made undeniable. Henry Molaison spent the rest of his life, more than 5 decades, as arguably the single most studied patient in the history of neuroscience. He lived first with family and later, as his needs grew more complex, in a nursing care facility, always under the guidance of researchers, most consistently Suzanne Corkin, a neuroscientist who worked with him for nearly her entire career, visiting him regularly for over 40 years. In all that time, by every account from the people who worked closest with him, Henry remained a famously agreeable and even cheerful participant in his own decades-long involuntary case study. He seemed, from what those who knew him described, to have made some kind of accommodation with a condition he could never actually remember having. A strange, quiet grace in the way he met every day fresh, without the accumulated weight of grievance or resentment that most of us would carry after a lifetime of profound loss. He never fully understood in any lasting way just how significant his own case had become to science. He couldn't. Every explanation offered to him about his own importance dissolved from memory within minutes, just like everything else. In some strange sense, Henry Molaison spent 55 years quietly and unknowingly contributing to one of the most important bodies of knowledge in the history of brain science, without ever once being able to remember doing it. He died in 2008 at the age of 82, and even then, his contribution to neuroscience wasn't finished. With the consent his family had arranged in advance, his brain was carefully preserved, then sliced into more than 2,000 extraordinarily thin sections over the course of a live-streamed, multi-day procedure watched by scientists and the public alike. A final, painstaking act of documentation, ensuring that even the physical structure of the brain that had taught the world so much about memory would itself be studied down to the smallest visible detail. There's a difficult question sitting underneath Henry's story that's worth naming directly, because it's part of what makes this case so enduringly uncomfortable, even for the researchers who dedicated their careers to it. Henry did not consent, in any meaningful sense, to becoming the most examined human mind in the history of neuroscience. The surgery that created his condition was, by the standards of medical ethics that exist today, recklessly experimental, performed without the kind of informed consent process or the caution around unproven procedures that would be required now. And once his condition existed, decades of research were built on a man who could never really understand, hold on to, or meaningfully consent anew to the ongoing use of his own mind and story. His family authorized much of what followed, but Henry himself lived every single day of that research in a kind of perpetual present tense, unable to ever fully grasp the scale of what was being asked of him or what was being learned. It's tempting, when we tell stories like this, to move quickly toward the neat scientific payoff, the discovery, the breakthrough, the reorganization of an entire field of study. And that payoff is real. Henry's case is, without exaggeration, one of the most important single contributions to our understanding of how memory works in any human brain ever recorded. But it's worth resisting the urge to let the science fully absolve the cost. A man lost the ability to build a continuous life, to let today connect to yesterday, to let love and grief and small daily moments accumulate into something that could be carried forward and called a life in the way most of us take entirely for granted, and in exchange, without ever really choosing it, and without ever being able to remember any of it, he gave the rest of us a far clearer understanding of the very thing he had lost. There's something quietly devastating and quietly beautiful sitting side by side in that trade. Henry Molaison never got to keep a single day of the last 55 years of his life, but because of him, the rest of us understand, with far more clarity than we ever could have without him, what it actually means to remember, and by extension, what it means to lose the ability to. Maybe that's the real weight of his story, not just what memory is. In the clinical, structural sense, his case helped researchers map out piece by piece. But what memory does for the rest of us, quietly, every single day, without our ever having to think about it. It lets yesterday's grief soften instead of striking fresh each time. It lets a familiar face stay familiar. It lets a life feel like one continuous thing rather than an endless series of disconnected present moments, each one arriving and vanishing without ever becoming part of a larger story. Henry never got to have that, and in losing it so completely, he ended up teaching the rest of us exactly how much it's worth.